Hi everyone, Jay here from Jade Productions, and here we're going to talk in our newest video for Beginner's Guide to Age of Sigmar, when we're going to be talking about Fyreslayers. So the Fyreslayers are an army of dwarven mercenary berserkers organized into lodges from the realm of fire. And what the Fyreslayers do is they go out and they're basically on a quest to resurrect their dead god. And they do this and by acting as mercenaries, signing oaths, and they'll fight for just about anyone as these mercenaries in exchange for gold. And from this gold, they're hoping to find this rare magical gold, which often gets mixed in amongst regular gold, which they transform into their magical runes, which they use to power themselves up in battle. So that's them. Now, in terms of on the tabletop, they're a small elite faction that's easy to collect because they don't have a lot of unit options. You kind of literally only have 3 standard units that form your army, and they're various shades of dwarven berserkers. And then you have like 7, 8, 9, 10 different options of heroes. 3 of which are just your hero options on giant flaming salamander lizard dinosaurs. It's as awesome as it sounds. So when it comes to the Fyreslayers in terms of performance on the tabletop, they are a aggressive, defensive, elite faction. So the whole faction is very, very killy and very powerful in terms of damage output. But a lot of their buffs revolve around making them absolutely immovable. Like, this is an army where typically the go-to build for a lot of competitive players, and just for a lot of players in general, is to go with large units of what is essentially the best unit in this book, which is called Half-Guard Berserkers. A large unit of these, supported by a lot of your defensive buffs, can essentially make them 2+ save for a turn, 3+ save, ignoring any spells cast on them on a 4+, with a 4-up to ignore damage, so long as a hero is nearby. And they're 2 wounds apiece with a 5-up save minimum, with a incredible damage output, and the ability to fight multiple times based on battalions. So that's the Hearthguard in a nutshell. That one unit kind of encapsulates the entire army. They're very aggressive, they're very powerful, they want to be getting into melee, and you don't want to be getting into melee with them while they're fully supported. And while they have their buffs on, they become really, really hard to shift. And so everything in this army is focused on doing 2 things: increasing the damage output of your Fyreslayers, or increasing the durability of your Fyreslayers. The third thing that your army particularly does is increases the speed of your Fyreslayers, because the Fyreslayers have 3 weaknesses that you should be aware of going into them. The first weakness that the Fyreslayers have is they have no magic, which means their only ways to deny magic are built into other mechanics, such as their relics. Then they don't have a lot of shooting. They're not particularly good at shooting. What shooting they have tends to be accurate, but decent, but short-ranged. You have a single dedicated shooting unit, which is particularly good at slowing down and dealing with enemy monsters, and that's your Orc Hearthguard, not to be confused with Half-Guard Berserkers. Different units. Then everything in your army essentially has throwing axes, which are very basic, simple weapons with a very short range. Typically, you're only going to fire them when you're already in combat, but it's extra potential damage, 5s and 5s. Don't argue with it, just throw them. Don't even go, it's not even worth it, just throw them. But they have those throwing axes, and so they have shooting across the board. It's just not particularly good shooting. They're not like other factions like the Caradhran Overlords. They're flying dwarven kin who are particularly good at shooting. And, well, I'm not going to say the Caradhrans are good at shooting. The Caradhrans just have a lot of firepower. They have a lot of long-range shooting. So there's that to contend with. The third is that on paper, without applying any buffs or using any of your things, the Fyreslayers are slow. Most of your basic Fyreslayers only have a 4-inch movement, but this is a very good book that they have in their second edition currently. So when it comes to Fyreslayers, they have a way around each of these weaknesses. So, no magic? Well, we have artifacts that can practically make us immune to magic or give us the chance to unbind it. Limited shooting? Well, what shooting we do have in terms of dedicated shooting units is decent and really screws over enemy monsters. On top of that, while we might be weak to shooting, we can really stack on the buffs to help mitigate any damage from any sort of source. Then on top of that, we're slow. Well, we actually have ways around that. We have multiple abilities that can make us faster. We can get stacked huge bonuses to our charge rolls. We're able to run in charge potentially. We can increase our movement once per game with our runes, which we'll get to in a second. And then we also have a number of other particularly good things to help counter most of our weaknesses to some extent. So they definitely lean into their thing, but they are a very strong faction. I want to make that very apparent. This is a strong, easy to play faction, which means they're highly competitive in the meta to an extent. That said, they're not without their exploitable weaknesses, which is why you don't just see them everywhere. So, as we delve into this army, the important things to note is I'll just quickly talk about your army in general. So, the first thing you should know is typically your allegiance abilities. This is your full-on army ability, and for you, at the Fyreslayers, it is the Urgold runes, which are once per game runes that you can fire off. And they're particularly good once per game buffs. And they have a standard version, where if you roll a 1 to 5 when activating it, or they have an enhanced version that you get when you roll a 6. And then each of these runes is, the key with Fyreslayers is figuring out when you need to activate your runes. So, for example, you have runes that give you extra rend. So, part of the challenge for Fyreslayers is figuring out when do I need to activate that rune. And so it comes down to, okay, so the rune of Awakened Steel. When do we activate that? Well, we want to activate that once we get into the thick of combat. Probably around turn 2 or 3. We really want to get the enhanced version if we can, but that's not always going to happen, so 1 rend is better than none. And a lot of our weapons that you can take for Fyreslayers do have rend 1, so they've got a good access to rend across the board, which with the basic rune of Awakened Steel, you can get that up to rend 2, which means you can really deal with armored enemies and really just lay on the damage. Your opponent's durability will no longer be tied to their armor saves because you'll be reducing it to such a point where the mathematics are going to be in your favor with the sheer number of attacks you can throw out. At the same time, you have to ask yourself, when is the right time to use my Rune of Relentless Zeal? The answer most players come to when it comes to Fyreslayers is the best time to fire off the Rune of Relentless Zeal is typically the first battle round or 2, since it adds 2 to your movement. This is because it takes you from move 4 to move 6, and getting on objectives early and getting up the board as quickly as possible for Fyreslayers is really important. The longer it takes you to reach your opponent or to reach your optimal position where your opponent now has to come to you, is more time they have to inflict damage to you from range. And unfortunately, things like Magmadroths, well, they're very weak to ranged attacks, and they get the most out of their abilities when they're fighting in melee combat. At the same time, you can't really do much damage back at range, so you want to get as close as possible really quickly. Then you have other runes, such as the Rune of Farsight, giving you reroll to your hit rolls, it adds 1 to your hit rolls for throwing axes. I'm also looking at the wrong one. I'm looking for the Rune of Fury. The Rune of Fury lets you re-roll hit rolls of 1 for your Fyreslayers. And these are global abilities, and you got to keep that in mind. They don't just affect a particular subsect of your Fyreslayer armies. Your Urgold runes affect everything in your army. So they are global buffs, but each one can only be used once per game. So you only have that chance to really get off your enhanced version. When you do get your enhanced version off, typically you'll get one enhanced version off per game. And when you do, they will be game changing. Otherwise, they serve as particularly good situational buffs that you can apply to your whole army. Now, the army also has a good number of command traits. It also has your command traits divided between your priests and your rune fathers. And so you have that going on, and so that's where your army is basically divided into. There is a third subsect, however, of how your heroes are divided. And you can see how your heroes are divided clearly based upon what your artifacts are. And so, while this army doesn't have a huge number of units to pick from, it does have a huge amount of options in terms of command traits. You have lodges, you have a huge number of relics, you have mount traits for your Magmadroths, and then you have prayers, and then you have your special Magma Invocation prayers. So there's a huge amount in this book. So there's quite a lot of variety to keep you from getting bored, despite the low unit choice in the army. And so you have some good options in just about every one of these, especially in your command traits. You have lots of artifacts. You have artifacts for your Rune Fathers and Rune Sons. You have artifacts for your special Berserker heroes. You have artifacts for your Rune Masters and Rune Smiters. And then you have artifacts for your banners. Your Magmadroths have a series of different mount traits. There's only really 2 of them that are particularly good. The primary one being the Coalheart Ancient, since it helps keep your guy alive long enough, which means it reduces the rend of attacks that target him. But I talk about this particular mount trait in general because Magmadroths are suicide bombs. You typically throw them into the enemy, and they don't have a huge damage output. Generally. They have a nice potential damage output, but they're not the most accurate things, and they degrade pretty badly. So, while their greatest strength comes from every time your opponent hurts the Magmadroth, he's likely to kill himself and deal more damage to himself. The longer you can keep that Magmadroth alive, the more you can still get out of it. So there is that. And unfortunately, you don't have any ways to heal on this army. Now, an important thing about this army, and now I'm not going to cover everything in this army in detail because that would take a really long time to do, to really go full in depth on this army. So for that, we'll wait for a sample list which is prepared and ready to go. But we'll talk about another defining factor here. And for the Fyreslayers, I mentioned that you don't have spells. That's true. You have a few counters to spells, which you can find in your artifacts, such as the Ashbeard or the Nulcidian Icon. 2 very essential relics. But instead, you have prayers, which are more reliable mechanic, potentially. Now, for prayers, they go off on a fixed number that is rolled on 1d6 in your hero phase instead of 2d6, but they can't be unbound by any sort of source. So, while they're technically harder to cast, because you're not rolling 2d6 and looking for averages most of the time, you're only looking for 1d6, you do have ways to buff these, such as from your relics, once again, but also from your scenery piece, the Magmic Forge, which is a particularly good scenery piece, despite looking like a fancy pizza oven, is free, as is all terrain in Age of Sigmar, so it's good to have it, and it helps ensures that these prayers get off, because these prayers are really good buffs, and you have these in place of a magic lore. So your prayers do that in its place. So your best prayer is the Prayer of Ash, giving you extra +1 to your save for a friendly unit wholly within 18 inches of your priest. Fantastic. And then you have other prayers where you pick an enemy unit, and on a 3-up they get -1 to hit. I should mention that the Prayer of Ash goes up on a 4+, so they don't always go up on a 3+. The Prayer of Ash, though, goes off on a 4+, so it varies. So you have ways to do it, but they get harder the better they are, but you have ways to improve their potential for going off, especially given how important these are for your army. And then you have other ones, such as the Prayer of Searing, the Ember Storm, which you get to pick a friendly unit of Volkite Berserkers or Hearthguard Berserker wholly within 18 inches of your priest, and they get to run in charge, which is fantastic because, again, you don't have much mobility, so the potential to be able to have a unit move 4 plus d6 and then charge 2d6 can be really helpful for getting around the board. And so not all of like every magic lore, just your prayers are not going to be awesome every time. For example, there are some that are not particularly great, like Molten Infusion, but they have their uses. So your prayers are basically your go-to for in terms of spells, and each priest in your army can pick one from the list, and they can cast and they can pray for it, plus any of the prayers that they have on their sheet. Plus any additional prayers they might know from you giving them extra prayers thanks to other options that you have. And on top of that, you can then do your Magma Invocations, and which are the endless spell equivalents that your army has. And then these are particularly good. I'll just briefly talk about the importance of the Runic Firewall. And this is a very good one because as a wall, it's able to block movement, and then it's able to help protect you from shooting. It's very important, but mastering its placement has been something that I know T has struggled with. It's definitely a hard thing to do. But in terms of the Magma Invocations, they each have their own individual purpose and are useful in their own way. But what you need to keep in mind is that you actually pay points for them. So it's not a lot of points, but keep in mind that you do have to pay for them. You don't just get them like you do the regular prayers. And then your faction has your lodges. Your lodges represent your sub-factions in the Fyreslayers, and there's 4 of them. Doesn't sound like a lot, but each one is particularly good. Now, in terms of having to skew into them with your purchases for your Fyreslayers, because your Fyreslayers are very expensive and annoying to purchase, when it comes to kind of skewing into any of the sub-factions, there's 2 that have a slight skew. In fact, they all have a slight skew to them, but there's only 2 that you can really... Well, there's only really one where you the other one can work by itself. There's only really one where you have to really go out and buy your army with the intention of running that one. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter how you build your army. You'd be able to run yourself as either generic with your own made-up lodge and using the generic traits, or you can spend a weekend pretty much going... your one game, I'm going to play Vostarg, because, well, I don't actually need to make any changes to my army, just change up a few of my relics and stuff. You don't need to buy anything special for them. And you can go from playing Vostarg, Greyfeard, Hermdar, just fine. So, they're all pretty good, they don't require any work in. And then, in terms of what they do, your Vostarg is, nice and aggressive, increasing your mobility and movement for your army, letting you be very fast very quickly. It actually has the potential for first turn charges, so that's very good. Your Greyfeard is focused on your heroes and having your heroes double team, and since you're already fielding a lot of them, it's pretty good for that. Gives you extra relics, nice and simple. It's not one of the most... heroes are... Well, they're not particularly the most effective things compared to nice giant hordes of Hearthguard Berserkers. That said, your heroes are still pretty decent. So, Greyfeard is not the most competitive one, but it is still more than usable. Then you have your Hermdar, which is probably your most balanced one, where Vostarg tries to make up for your faction's inherent weakness of speed, and Greyfeard tries to enhance your heroes, which you're already being forced to take a lot of because the majority of your army is heroes. Hermdar operates on a case of making you even harder to shift. So Hermdar is probably the most competitive one. I'll put that out there straight away. When it comes to sub-factions for Fyreslayers, it makes you much more defensive in terms of its command trait. It means it makes you immune to battle shock when you're sitting on objective, so it makes you very hard to shift for the objective game. You have a command ability where you can pick one of your Berserker units and they can fight at the start of the command phase before anyone else fights, letting you really pack on the damage. So there's that. The last one is Lofnir, and this is the one that you slightly have to build into. And that's mostly just to get the most out of its traits and abilities, and that's because this one is all about Magmadroths. So when you field multiple Magmadroths, you can field an extra Magmadroth in your army, plus all your Magmadroths get a trait, not just one, plus one for every battalion. So there is that to keep in mind. So when it comes to this faction, and even then, you can still build into all 4 of these without skewing your purchases when you're buying your army. But Lofnir is the one that skews just that slightly hardest with the focus and emphasis on Magmadroths. In terms of the rest of your faction, as I said, it's made up of a nice bunch of heroes. So you have your 3 heroes on Magmadroths. You have your Runefather on Magmadroth, which is the best choice. You can take him on foot, but he's just not quite as good. That said, Magmadroths themselves typically serve as suicide bombs, and they provide a bit of speed, and they increase the size of aura abilities. So they have a lot of advantages over their on-foot counterparts, typically. But the Magmadroths are suicide bombs in terms of mortal wounds, because they just deal lots of them, and they deal them mostly when they're dying. So when you inflict damage onto them, they have a chance to inflict mortal wounds with their lava blood. On top of that, they breathe their fire, so they can deal more mortal wounds that way, and then they do their tail sweep at the end when they're fighting, which lets them deal more mortal wounds, which makes them excellent for tying up enemy units, crashing into things that don't deal a lot of damage that you just want to kind of suicide blob into, particularly given how and then they're also not bad in combat, really. So on top of that, they also deal decent combat. So their maneuverability combined with this ability to basically suicide into stuff and assure mutual destruction means they're very good for mind games. They're very good for controlling battlefield and movements. And it's often a case of you can basically allow Magmadroths allow you to pick your battles a lot. So you can go, do you charge me and risk that unit dying to the mortal wounds? And if you don't kill me, I just get to keep on going forward? Or do you stay there, not engage me, and you try and gun me down from range, but if you don't succeed, I'll then get to charge you, and I can still breathe fire on you and do all my other stuff. And my army still gets the awesome abilities that I hand out. So Magmadroths present an interesting playstyle. They're very interesting monsters to consider because they're not the most effective monsters in terms of raw damage output. They kind of look kind of disappointing on paper. But performance-wise, provided they don't die in the first turn to just being gunned down, because that is their biggest weakness, shooting. Because they don't get off any of their abilities when it comes to shooting. So they can't make up their points by dealing damage back in that particular case. But it is important to note that in terms of monsters, they are fairly cheap. You then have your Auric Rune Smiter on Magmadroth and your Auric Rune Smiter. So your Auric Rune Smiter is a basic priest who's pretty decent. Of course, he's a priest. He has a fairly good gimmick. He's got abilities and equipment that he can use to increase the range of his prayers. He has a particularly good synergistic combo for a once per game effect, which increases your saves. So there's a lot of ways to increase your saves in this army. And then he's very good on the Magmadroth because the Magmadroth gives him an extra protection, giving him extra wounds, and gives him a bigger base for bigger auras from his and bigger range for his prayers. And on top of that, increases his damage output. But that said, unlike the Auric Runefather, where the guy on foot is just a cheaper alternative that's not particularly great, the Auric Runesmiter on foot has a fantastic ability where you can take him during deployment and one other unit of Fyreslayers, and you can put them in reserves, and you can put them at this during your turn during the game, at the end of any of your movement phases, anywhere on the board 9 inches away. Another way to bypass your slow movement by using deep striking movement shenanigans to deliver a unit where you need it. And so long as you have one of your very powerful units inside of reserve, it's an excellent way of playing mind games with your opponent and controlling the battlefield, because every move they do is going to make them think twice. And so you can deliver guys directly onto objectives. You can shift the power of the game by putting them somewhere your opponent doesn't expect. If he's screwed up his maneuvering and he's left just this perfect gap where you can put your guys in and you can get into the rear lines, you can get hammer and anvil, you can really use this. And its effectiveness does vary by a size depending on how you're using it to either grab objectives or really smash into opponents, but it is very good to have that. So a Runesmiter on foot and a Runesmiter Magmadroth, both are very good options. The Auric Runesun on Magmadroth and the Auric Runesun, they might be the probably worst options for heroes in the army. They work best when you put them in pairs, but they are cheap. The Runesun has a Javelin, which is a fairly decent monster hunting attack, and also used as a ranged weapon. It's pretty good. But again, the problem with Runesuns is that their build is that they're not fantastic in terms of their damage output, and to be fantastic, they have to be near another Runesun, which means you have to invest in 2 of them to really make them effective. That said, the cheap Runesun on foot is only 100 points, and he has an excellent command ability which gives a friendly Fyreslayers unit +1 to wound. This is excellent when combined with just about anything in your army, in terms of your basic troops, because +1 you already wound mostly in this army on 3s for your best units and for the majority of your units. So the ability to wound on 2s is fantastic. So he's very good in terms of that ability, but it's really his only thing that you'd want to be taking him for. Then you have your Auric Runemaster. So your Auric Runemaster, he's your primary priest. So whereas the Runesmiter is an auxiliary priest with a few nifty little tidbits and abilities, this guy is meant to be your primary priest. He's meant to be your Archmage equivalent. He's your mage equivalent. Now, his abilities in terms of utility are not as fantastic as the Runesmiter, but he does have some decent abilities. He can really mess with terrain and enemy movement as a result by making them deadly. He has an ability to really do some increase your effectiveness by rolling to see whether or not your opponent has some gold, which gives you re-rolls against them. Other than that, he's just good, reliable prayer casting with a good built-in prayer, and he does make the Auric Hearthguard. He does make the Auric Hearthguard battle line if he is your general. So there is that to keep in mind. Then you have your Battlesmith. Your Battlesmith is your banner bearer. The Battlesmith is really, really important. He gives +1 save to everything wholly within his aura, which is just nuts. And on top of that, when he dies, a unit of Volkite Berserkers or Hearthguard Berserkers nearby can pretty much just say that they're not going to move the rest of the game. They can only pile in an inch, and they get to reroll all hits and wounds for the rest of the game. So if someone snipes him, he's crazy. And this is the guy who can carry some pretty crazy artifacts that make your army go from really good to your opponent probably wants to hit you. This army can be really frustrating to play against because of the sheer durability. Because in Age of Sigmar, What breaks balance is a unit's durability combined with its killing power. And so a unit that can both be buffed up to be nigh unkillable, which the Battlesmith really helps do, and a unit that at the same time can kill just about anything, absolutely breaks the balance of Sigmar. Fortunately, the way that missions are written means that even in the cases of you have really, really strong armies like this, the missions will ultimately be the determining factor in terms of what army wins, regardless of how strong a book is. And then on top of these, you have two other characters, which are two different kinds of Berserkers. The Doomseeker, which is an okay Berserker, and then the Grimwrath Berserker, which is a different kind of Berserker, who, rather than... he gets to essentially fight twice, and he has some strong damage output. So he's pretty good as a throwaway for going after stuff, and he can deal a lot of damage. He's been known to do a lot of stuff. He used to be even more powerful before the 2nd edition codex. And then your faction, after that, that's it. After that, it's literally your 3 troop choices. And so your choices are essentially your Volkite Berserkers, which are your standard battle line. They can go in squads of 10 up to 30. They're decently priced. They have a number of options for their weapons in terms of you can mix and match. They're all 2 wounds apiece with a 5-up save. So the Volkite Berserkers have a special ability that they can use once per game at the start of the combat phase, where if you think they're about to die and get wiped out, units from that squad before they're removed get to pile in and fight. So they still get to fight even if your opponent kills them all. So there is that sort of backup there. Which is nice and handy, which makes them good for holding on to holding on to objectives. So you can run them in max squads of 30 and be absolutely wrecking things, or you can run them in minimum squads of 10 and holding objectives, and you still have very effective and somewhat points effective units. You can run them with their shields and a axe or pick. If you're going to run them with the shields, which is when you charge with the shields, the shields give them a little bit extra save, but when you charge with the shields, there's a chance you'll do mortal wounds on the charge. If you're going to run them with shields, take them with the war pick. It's just statistically better over the axe when it's by itself, and it hits a little worse, but it wounds a little better and has got a rend 1, so very nice on a small unit of 10 with the shields. If you're running larger units or you want something particularly more killy, and you're not cared about them surviving too much, take them with the 2 hand axes. Just outright gives you re-rolls for increasing your damage capability. Your Orc Hearthguard, as we discussed earlier, are your primary shooting unit. They're good. They can take damage and act as bodyguards for heroes. Otherwise, they're fairly decent shooting attacks with decent range. Hitting on 4s, 3s, -1, 1 damage. Doesn't sound particularly good, but that can do a lot of damage on mass fire, considering that's 2 shots a guy. They come in units of 5, max units of 20. Deep striking them can be a fun little thing to do with the Rune Smiter. They don't benefit from a lot of stuff in terms of your runes, so it's a little unfortunate there. You don't have a lot of synergy with them, but they do provide that shooting firepower, and they make monsters that they target that get hit by their shooting attacks -1 to hit and halve the movement value. An excellent counter to monster spam armies, things like Seraphon, Terrorgeist build Flesh Eater Courts, a few other armies. Can really screw over the Lumineth giant mountains of the Avatar. I'm still learning Lumineth. I'm not sure what they're called. The mountain avatars, the Spirit of the Mountains, that's what they are. And then you got your Hearthguard Berserkers. Now, Hearthguard Berserkers are the most powerful thing in your army. Just flat out. I'll say that. They're 2 wounds apiece, 5-up save. They ignore wounds on a 6. They have 2 different weapon options, one of which is an all-rounder and fairly good, you can't go wrong with. The other one is slightly better at carving through specialist targets. and that's the poleaxe. The poleaxe deals additional 2 mortal wounds when you meet the requirements. So it can deal mortal wounds instead of its regular damage. So that makes it good at carving through mostly, because of its damage potential, high armored target units that have lots of protection stacked onto them. So they're good for that. So they're specialized in that regard, but they're good in general. So you can't go wrong with either option. But the broadaxe is typically the just best option because its profile means it can deal with just about anything. Because it's 2 attacks, 3s and 3s, -1, 2 damage. And you can really get these Hearthguard fighting multiple times. So Hearthguard are absolutely fantastic and amazing. They're units of minimum squad of 5. They come in a maximum squad of 20. 400 points for a max squad as of recording this. So they're pretty crazy in terms of that. And they get even better when you realize that you can stack up the buffs to take them from a 5-up save to an almost permanent 3-up save once you get all your buffs off. And then, once per game, a 2-up save if you've stacked everything right. So a 2-up save on 2 wounds on something that can potentially fight twice with very reliable damage output. And on top of that, you can put them near a character with the Null City and icon, and now they're ignoring any magic that targets them on a 4-up. 50-50 chance to ignore any magic that just targets them. Then, combine that with their 6-up to ignore damage, goes to a 4-up to ignore damage when they're near a hero. It's the 4-up to ignore damage when near a hero that makes the Hearthguard, combined with their damage output, absolutely lucrative. All this combined, it's actually very easy to pull off. Like, it happens in every game with Fyreslayers that I fought or played with the Fyreslayers. You just pull it off every time, and it turns things into a slog. And that's why they're very expensive in terms of models and points. And so they're kind of busted ludicrous. But again, they're not without their weaknesses. They can be overcome. But they are extremely powerful. So keep that in mind. Hearthguard Berserkers, you probably want 2 units of 20. That's 800 points. That's half your army almost. And it's going to be all you need, really, once you add in all your characters and maybe a few Volkites, and you can make them battle line. And then, just to wrap up, in terms of what this army does, you have your terrain, which we talked a little bit about before, but your terrain essentially gives you +1 to your prayers, and then it has an ability that you can use it, and so it has a once per game ability that you can exchange, but then you no longer get the +1 to your prayers. It lets you re-roll once per game, essentially. A re-roll of 1s for save rolls in exchange for basically you just can't use it ever again. So it's, as far as the terrain features go for the different factions, definitely one of the best ones. But to get the +1 to your prayers, your priest has to be within 6 inches of it. So deploying it is definitely something that is really, you've got to put some time considering in terms of where is the battle going to be fought, what kind of scenario is it, where are the objectives, how are the points scored. And then you've got some easy to build battalions. So your primary battalions are essentially the Lords of the Lodge, the Warrior Kinband, and the Forge Brethren. You have some other ones, but these are your 3 primary ones that are very easy to build at their minimum cost, and they each provide fairly good buffs. And of course, you have lots and lots of relics in this army, so the more of these you can include, the more relics you can get, the more Magmadroth traits you can get. So, and the more command points you get, because this army is command point hungry, actually. So that is something to really bear in mind, because a lot of your really powerful abilities all play off your command points. So prayers and command abilities. It's where most of your things are, so you're going to need those. Fortunately, there's lots of ways to generate those, or a few ways to generate those, and you can spend them kind of sparingly, but if you have lots of them, you go from a kind of, as we talked about, the really good faction to get out. To just get out. Get away. Get off my table. I'm not playing this. That may have been my response at one point to a certain list that I fought with Seraphon, when Seraphon had their first edition book. So, you've got these battalions. The Lords of the Lodge, everyone will tell you it's the best one. It flat out is. It's kind of ridiculous, especially when you pair it with the Hermdar or the Vostarg Lodges for those sub-factions. Pretty much you have to take a Rune Father, or a Rune Father and Magmadroth, a Rune Master, a Battlesmith, so all things you already want, and then a unit of Hearthguard Berserkers, another thing you already want. This one's just clearly the best, because it has things you already want. It's 140 points for this battalion, so it costs the same as not taking a unit of minimum Volkites. And then the Hearthguard Berserkers in the battalion can pile in and fight twice, so long as they are wholly within 12 inches of any hero from the battalion. Now, you pair this with Hermdar, and you spend a command point, and you can have a max unit of 20 of these fighting 3 times in a combat phase. So, it's crazy. It's crazy. But that's how you play Fyreslayers and win. If you want to play Fyreslayers and have fun, you can literally just smash your list together, go for the basic things. They're not impossible to beat. I want to bear that in mind. I've talked a lot about how powerful the Fyreslayers are. That is because they are a very solid and very good book. But they are somewhat mono-build in terms of their competitiveness. They have this immediate lure of, well, I don't have a lot of options, but what options I do have are very good. And there's, of these few options, one of them just stands out as absolutely insane. So, as you expect, it's one of those things. Don't feel bad about playing this. Don't feel bad playing against anyone who's fielding Fyreslayers and going for this. It's just the army itself. It's this hyper-elite, hyper-defensive, very killy, aggressive faction. That's just how they are. So, keep that in mind. It's just how they play. They're not broken. They can be defeated. They can be outmaneuvered in any number of ways. On objectives, if you can assassinate their characters, if you can get the things right. I've found typically the best way to engage armies like this, and armies like the Daughters of Cain, who they are very similar to along with the Flesh Eater Courts. All 3 of these armies are very fast, very aggressive, very killy. What the Fyreslayers break the mold with is that they're actually not fast at base, but they can become very fast, but they're very, very defensive, so they sit on objectives very well. And so the answer to each 3 of these is that just avoid them and shoot them. And then if you're looking to do this, you need to be aware of that, and you need to plan for those weaknesses. And the army is well-rounded and well-balanced, so you have ways to do it. So that is really it for the Fyreslayers. A very easy to collect, very easy to buy and build an army. Easy to play, hard to master overall, but they're very aggressive and very defensive in terms of what they do. So their aggressive defensiveness really works. And so the army in itself is a contradiction. Like, something, you look at other armies like, well, they're super aggressive, but they have very little defense. Well, here is an army that can do both, but it's at the cost of some other things. Now, magic is a huge weakness, as I said, but you have ways to patch it. So now I'm just repeating myself. Overall, the army is very good and competitive. When it comes to collecting them, I would definitely recommend that you start with your heroes. Know which ones you need to get, which ones you want to get. Their get starting box is an excellent starting point, obviously. But the number one thing you should expect to be buying with this army is lots of boxes of the Hearthguard Berserker box. Now, the Hearthguard Berserker box builds both the Hearthguard Berserkers and the Auric Hearthguard. So you're going to need those, and you're going to need probably one or more. So in terms of grabbing one of every character, it's very easy and very easy to do. You'll probably want maybe an extra Rune Smiter, but again, also very easy to do. So once and if you're gonna have them, 2 Rune Suns, just 2 Rune Suns. If you're gonna field them, grab 2 of them. You might not always take 2, but have 2 of them just in case you feel like doing it. And so they don't have any specific build requirements for this army, so you can just grab the stuff. They're very easy to buy and purchase. They are very expensive. You're not going to have a huge amount of guys on the tabletop. And they're painting them can be a little bit of a challenge, but that's because they're mostly flesh. I highly recommend contrast paints, actually, for this army. Simply because a lot of what they have in terms of when you see them and their models is they have their fancy headdresses, which you can detail, and they have their mohawks, which is good for contrast. And then they have their flesh, which is good for contrast. And then they have their loincloths, also good for contrast. And then they have a lot of detail on them because they're very nice models. But it's a case of the contrast can basically speed it up, because you will be painting a lot of naked, half-naked dwarves. Just you will. So that is just a thing to keep in mind. So I have been Jay from Jade Productions, and this has been Beginner's Guide to Fyreslayers. Now, I've had to cut out a lot of stuff here. I endeavored to cover it as succinctly as possible. There's a lot of synergies and tactics and really cool things. And if you'd really like specifics on this, you can leave it in the comments below if you have any questions. If you have any queries and of any kind, I have a Discord you can go to and you can ask in real time directly there about stuff. And then a sample list which is going to delve more into the tactics and present a very competitive list is going to be coming out next week, so keep an eye on that. In the meantime, I have been Jay from Jade Productions. See you next time. Happy wargaming. Goodbye.